really, why communicate your research at all?
Okay, that's a little bit of a loaded question, hey? So I think, first of all, I'm a total science nerd. Like, I think science is cool, right? I look around me every day, and you look at the types of things that we can do that just a few years ago people dreamed up in the lab. I know someone who lives with a stem cell transplant. She went from not being able to move at all to being fully functional. Like, that's cool. And we don't do a great job of telling people how super badass the stuff that we do every day really is. So first, I think science is cool. Second, I think as someone living with a chronic illness, and I can tell you that I'm here in front of you, fully functioning, you would never guess that I live with a chronic illness. That's because of science, and that's because of what we've been able to do with translating findings into actual use. So I think that a lot of what you do offers hope to people. So there's lots of people that feel like nobody knows what they're going through, that, what am I ever going to do? How am I ever going to get back to some kind of normal with whatever they're living with? And I think that if we start doing a better job of communicating the kinds of work that we do, that gives a lot of people hope. And you'd be really, really surprised by that. I'm sure you've all heard patient stories or, patients tell their experiences. That gives tons of inspiration to other people. I think we owe it to people. Let's get real. A lot of people have paid for the work that's happening in labs all across the country as taxpayers, and we don't think of them as investors in research and in the work that's happening. And so why aren't we telling them where huge gobs of money are going? Maybe less than we'd like it to be at this point, but why aren't we doing a better job about that? And I get it that people are, our careers are often measured by the number of publications we have, the number of patents we have, all of those things. I guess what's more immeasurable is how you can actually impact patients, you can impact people down the street, you can impact people around the corner. And so those are some of the reasons why I think we owe it to people to tell them what we're holed up in a lab doing all the time, or why what we're doing is actually important.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to build on what Dawn said, and I think it's particularly important to think about this carefully in the area of health research, where, who here receives some kind of funding for the research that you do? Yeah, okay. Put your hand up if you receive funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Okay. So do you know if somewhere on that grant you indicate that you're going to help someone with some kind of disease? Yeah. Who thinks that they have that somewhere baked into their grant proposal? Right? And think about how much time it took you or your PI to write that whole grant, and tell me the percentage of time that it took you to write that section on broader impacts or disease impact. Did that take a significant amount of time? Who spent a lot of time thinking about that? One person. I want everybody to sort of really think about this, because that this is the whole point of health research, right? I think that many Canadians who fully believe in research and support research really do support it with the thought that it will at some point impact the health of Canadians. And I think it's worthwhile being very honest about what your actual plans are and what might happen in an ideal universe if things just miraculously happen, right? I think we're kind of in a shift where we're going to need to talk about that a little bit more. And I was hoping, like, just before we go into the next question, I was hoping that Dawn could tell all of you a little bit more about sort of this position. I mean, we also, knowing that the people that are in the room here, we're trying to sort of raise awareness about different places that you can make an impact on the development of new technologies, crossing that the translational pathway. And some of the work that Dawn is currently doing at Clinical Trials Ontario, I think, is quite relevant. So I was hoping you could just tell them a little bit more about that position, because who knows that Clinical Trials Ontario exists? Well, hopefully everyone knows it. I just told you. They're tired.
It's okay.
But so this is an organization that exists that's trying to really help. This is sort of a key partner, a key stakeholder that can help us move forward. So, Dawn, if you could tell us a little bit more about just that organization.
I can. And you triggered one more thing in me that I think is really important to everyone in this room who does science, and that is that I'm very involved in social media, and I see various groups, I'll say, eroding what science has brought out there. I see all kinds of celebrities talking pseudoscience. And so I think we as well owe it to people to be talking about the truth in science and what's really happening. And that really upsets me, seeing, people follow famous people and think that they're going to have some miraculous treatment. So I think that now more than ever, too, we need to have a solid voice around science and facts, and myth bust, if you will. So Clinical Trials Ontario is up on the 4th floor in this tower over here. And we were set up with Government of Ontario funding a few years ago. We're now on our 2nd term. And really the goal is to help create, I'll say, Ontario as a preferred destination to do high quality clinical trials of obviously the highest ethical standards. And so, well, that sounds pretty lofty, right? So how are we actually going to accomplish that? So there's really 3 main pillars there. One is to help streamline clinical trials. So I'm sure you know, if you do a multi-center trial, you're making multiple submissions to different ethics boards, et cetera. So over the past few years, CTO has really been working hard to streamline particularly the ethics review, so that now in Ontario, if you are doing a multi-center trial, you can submit one package to one board of record that can review your trial. So that can significantly increase the speed with which your research can potentially be approved. Secondly, we're looking to engage the public, engage healthcare professionals and patients with the dialogue around clinical trials. So a few years ago when CTO was first founded, it was more engaging people in trials. There's a subtle difference between the in and with, right? The in part seems to be, well, are you going to be a participant in clinical trials? The with part, you shift it to a conversation about trials. So we need to start talking about these things, right? This doesn't always happen. It's great that you have a forum to do that today, but there are a lot of people out there that don't know much about clinical trials, or they have lots of preconceived notions about, honestly, rats in cages and everything else, right? You think of that famous Time magazine cover with a person in a cage, and that's the concept that a lot of people have around clinical trials. And lastly, because we really have an economic slant, it is to promote Ontario as that place to come to do clinical trials in Canada. Something like 50% of trials in Canada are run in Ontario. There's a huge population here where clinical trials happen. And the part of CTO that I work with is really the engage with piece. So really helping patients and the public especially engage with clinical trials. And our concept there is to increase awareness, but we're not going to do that through public awareness campaigns that cost a lot of money. What we want to do is build relationships with organizations, and we've started to really do that, especially with patient advocacy organizations and health charities, groups like the Foundation Fighting Blindness, and working together with those organizations. They've already got lots of stakeholders that are interested in science and clinical trials, and so it means more for us to be working with them and to figure out how we can better engage their stakeholders. We do want to actively involve the public in those conversations as well, and people, I guess, being part of the design process of research and clinical trials is really important to us. And I think you probably touched a little bit about that today, about designing trials that honestly meet patient needs, that make a difference in patient lives, and that change outcomes for them. So that's a big part of what we do. And lastly, we've done some work with healthcare providers, and just doing some lit reviews, we know that there's not a great level of confidence when people come to their healthcare providers and ask about clinical trials and ask about maybe how they can find a trial or for information on getting trials. So we're starting to do some work so that people can have better conversations, and they can, within those conversations, there's an easy way for people, if they would like to explore the option of clinical trials, to be able to do that. We know from some survey work that we've done that the number one source that people would go to if they're interested in a clinical trial is their healthcare provider, either their family physician or their specialist. And so we have to do a better job of equipping those people to be prepared to have conversations about that. So that's a little bit, that's more than a little bit about what we do.
No, I'm so glad, because it's been, as I said earlier, a lot of information has been shared today, and everybody in this room is here because they're interested in actually developing biotherapeutics. I mean, that's why people are still here. They've sat with us all day. And there really has not been much talk about patients. There hasn't been much talk about people who are actually going to be impacted by these developments. And I think, we've been talking about, you have to think about reimbursement, you have to think about your, GMP and how you're going to have everything. And there are so many things to think about. But if at the very beginning you're not really, really thinking and engaging with the people who you want to impact, then you're kind of setting yourself up for a hard road ahead. Because if you don't understand the disease condition, if you don't know people who are living with the disease that you are trying to impact, then that's a big piece of missing information that you have. And so I'm so thrilled that we can kind of end this with really thinking about and challenging you all to think about how you can work more early public and patient engagement into the work that you're doing, because I really do think it's increasingly going to be recognized as something you just must do if you want to be successful. And, we saw some patient-centered language, and there's always a push about patient-centeredness. And I think we're now seeing more and more a shift towards patient partnerships throughout the full research continuum. And I can certainly say that coming out of academia and going into the health charity sector, where at the Foundation Fighting Blindness, it is people who are living with blinding eye diseases who are just a huge engine driving research. They are raising money, they're running grant competitions, they're involved in decision making, and I think that in the government sector, we try to we develop patient-oriented research initiatives, and we think about how can we make things more patient-centered. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the patients who have been really at these grassroots health charities to think about how do you do things in a patient-partnered kind of way.
Yeah, and I always relate it. I tell people, I love my rheumatologist. He's helped me get to where I am today. He doesn't live 24/7 with my disease. And so I think that's important for you to think about that. And when I have my 15-minute consult with him, I can't possibly download and what's just happened in 6 months of my life with him at that point. So to Mary's point, patients are a wealth of information about what they live with day in and day out. Our specialists are wonderful miracle makers most of the time. But honestly, my rheumatologist goes home at night. I know he's still thinking about what went on in the clinic, but he doesn't get up in the morning with morning stiffness. He doesn't have issues with fatigue. He doesn't have the same issues with pain. And all those things that always come up in our patient community as being unmet needs. Mm-hmm. And so don't get me wrong, the therapies that people work on are wonderful. They've enabled things in the inflammatory arthritis community that's just never happened before. But trust me, there's still lots going on in people's lives that they need help with. And so I always liken it that way, that I'm the lived experience person. My rheumatologist is definitely the medical expert. I'd never question him on that. But he certainly doesn't live in my body, that's for sure. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind, that, you know, patients want to be often, they want to be part of a process. They want to help you. They are enthusiastic. I just went to your event last night, and you certainly don't have to dumb it down for that crew, because some of the questions they asked blew me away.
I know, it's true. It's true. And I, you know, part of what we wanted people to think about, and hopefully we can now sort of shift into a more interactive part to prevent people from getting a little bit too tired at the end of the day. But I was wanting to just have sort of a back and forth and include comments from all of you about who has ideas about what are perhaps the best ways that you can communicate the research that you're doing. Or do you think it's easiest to start with the worst ways, some things that you should just not do?
You should just avoid?
Because I have one thing that is it really irks me, and I keep pushing everybody in the scientific community to really think hard about this. And actually, this came up last night. So the number one question that I get asked whenever I share there's a great new discovery, great new scientific discovery, great publication, look at this great grant, the number one question that the patients who I work with every day, they want to know, well, when is that going to impact me? And the most common answer I get, there's actually those answers fall into two categories. One is, anyone want to guess the most common answer? I don't know. I don't know, and how dare you ask me? Because that's not how science works. I don't know. And if anybody who gives you an answer is lying, right? So that's one. Who's heard a variation of that answer?
Definitely heard.
Be honest. Be honest. Who's had a mentor say a version of that to them? Right? Like, I think we need to be like, this is in the culture, right? That's part of the scientific culture, is that you think that question is unanswerable. And then there's the other most common answer, who you've probably all given it. So any guesses on what the next common answer is that I think is horrible? Come on, any guessers? Ken. 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
And I think that why those answers bother me so much is because, you know, as someone, like as a scientist, like scientists are maybe not always the best at documenting, but like you guys are incredible planners. You write these grants that are hundreds of pages long, that are so detailed with all kinds of aims and sub-aims and like so much detail. Like the fact that you can't answer a question about, and how long do you think these aims are going to be? I was chatting with Julia about this. So many people in the scientific community have this huge aversion to the word milestones. Like, there's all sort of like there's some people you just don't use that word with because they hate it so much. But why does that have to be a bad word? So I think that it's part of this cultural shift of owning the fact that as a scientist, you do an incredible amount of planning, meticulous amount of planning, and we need to have a more open and honest discussion about where you're at, what kinds of things you're planning to do, and what more resources you'll likely need to take something forward. And what we've learned today is a heck of a lot, right? There are many, many, many steps that need to happen before you can get from the bench to the bedside. And I hope that we can all move towards having kind of more detailed and nuanced discussions around this topic.
I think people appreciate honesty. I mean, you know, saying I don't know the answer to that is not a terrible thing, but at least trying to there's nothing wrong with walking somebody through the context of what of what you think that would look like, or even, what you think the steps would be to get there. Maybe I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's got to go through this, and this before it can get into people, or something to that effect. I'm going to be honest. Another word I would just like to strike is when we talk about people as subjects. Subjects are math, science, language arts. Participants are people. They've actively chosen to participate in a clinical trial or in a research study. Yes, I know that you're studying them as a subject, but that's just the worst label to have in the world. So if you take one thing away from anything we've been saying up here, please strike subject. I know it's in TCPS, but that's just the worst word.